Welcome to Chapter 10. In the last chapter, we examined the effects of groups on behavior and some of the benefits of belonging to groups. If we look more broadly, we see a strong tendency for people to affiliate and bond with others. And so one question is why? Why do we see this strong desire to seek out others? From an evolutionary perspective, the argument is that doing so promotes survival. Those who were bonded with others were more likely to be able to defend themselves from predators, to acquire sufficient food stores, and that this allowed them to be better able to survive. So, because being connected to others and collaborating with others conferred some evolutionary or survival advantage for our ancestors, that it became essentially hardwired, that it was in our genes to have this strong desire or maybe even a need to connect to others, to be bonded with others. And there's quite a bit of converging evidence to support this explanation. And so if we look at our response to anxiety and stress seems to increase our desire to seek out others. We look at the effects of social support. It can act as a buffer to stress, decreasing the likelihood that the stress that we experience deteriorates our health. Those who have a strong social support system are better able to recover from illness. And there's even research to suggest that a lack of social support actually predicts mortality. And so, given this strong desire, maybe even a need to belong, it is somewhat striking that we don't find that people seek out relationships indiscriminately, that they attempt to form an infinite number of social connections and bonds. Instead, people seem to be highly selective in who they seek out to form, particularly an intimate, close interpersonal attachment with, and potentially even more selective in their attempts to seek out romantic partners. One explanation for this selectivity is simply cognitive capacity, that we lack the mental processing power to remember an infinite number of social connections and relationships, that we're limited in terms of the size of our brain and processing power. And so there's research to suggest that the average number of social connections, that the social network size, both in terms of face-to-face interactions and in terms of online social networks, that the average size is around 150 social connections. And if we look at the social core, which is described as those individuals with which you have regular social contact and intimate relationships, that this social core is a much smaller group of individuals, maybe only about 10 people that we form close, intimate bonds with. And so one of the questions of this chapter is, can we predict who you are likely to form a close, intimate connection with? Given that you have a lot of choices of who to form connections with and that you tend to be selective in this process, is this process entirely random or completely unique to the individual? Or do we see guiding principles across individuals? Can we predict, on average, who a person is likely to form a close personal relationship with? And the research in social psychology suggests that researchers are able to do this. And the first effect that we'll talk about is what's called the propinquity effect. And this is really simple and straightforward. The prediction is that an individual is more likely to form a connection, an interpersonal relationship with someone who is close to them in terms of physical distance, that we can look at the actual physical, geographical layout of someone's environment and predict who they're likely to be friends with. The prediction is that they're more likely to be friends with people who are near them in terms of physical space. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is in just a minute. But first, if we look at the classic study that demonstrates this, Bessinger and colleagues in 1950 used the MIT dorms as a means to predict friendship formation. The dorms that they utilized were somewhat unique in the fact that these particular dorms were more set up similar to apartments, and they were specifically designed for students who were married but still wanted to live on campus. But they have something that is very important for experimental control that's more in line with the traditional dorm setup, in that these couples were randomly assigned to units at the beginning of the semester. And so that is incredibly important, because if we looked at apartments out in the community, there's some degree of individual selection in terms of which unit you want to rent, and we have people who at different points in time are moving in and out of the complex. That's not the case here. So these MIT apartment kind of dorm complexes, we have all couples being randomly assigned at the beginning of the fall semester to one of these units. And so let's say that we have an individual who at the beginning of the fall semester is randomly assigned to Unit 2. Bessinger and colleagues had a very simple dependent variable. They asked individuals at the end of the academic year, who are you friends with? Right? Rate your top 3 friends this year that you've made. What Bessinger and colleagues found was that our person here, who is randomly assigned to Unit 2, was significantly more likely to be friends with the people in Unit 3 or Unit 1 compared to the people in Unit 5 or Unit 9. And now think about how interesting this is. The fact that since they're randomly assigned to units, there's no reason for the people in Unit 1 or Unit 3 to be more similar in terms of their hobbies, their interests, their majors, their beliefs, values, etc., compared to Unit 9 or 10. So really the only thing here is that they are physically closer, right? They're next door as opposed to down the hall or on a different floor. And so we see really shocking numbers here in terms of their results. So 41% of next door neighbors indicated that they were close friends. And that's compared to almost half, right? Only 22% of those who lived 2 doors apart said that they were close friends. Only 10% of those who lived on opposite ends of the hall indicated that they were close friends. Even more kind of shocking is that people were 10 times more likely to be friends with individuals who lived in the same building as them compared to another building. And so all this is just propinquity. The physical layout of the building predicted friendship formation. Individuals were more likely to be friends with those who lived closer to them compared to living further away. From a real world perspective, this makes sense if we think about the fact that you're much more likely to form a intimate bond with someone who lives in your neighborhood compared to someone who lives halfway across the world. You may have a great deal in common with that person halfway across the world. If you met, you may really hit it off, but what is the likelihood that you run into that person that lives halfway across the world versus what are the odds that you run into the person who lives right next door to you, right? So we see that one explanation for the propinquity effect is just mere exposure. We talked about mere exposure at the very beginning of the semester, and we described mere exposure as a tendency for people to like stimuli that they have been repeatedly exposed to. So all things being equal, as long as you have kind of a neutral baseline opinion of the stimulus, with repeated exposure, you will grow to like it. And this is true of abstract shapes, random objects, and it seems to be true for people. Right? Those people that you repeatedly encounter, that you've had repeated exposure to, you tend to develop a more favorable opinion of those individuals, and you are more likely to form a personal relationship with those individuals. And so, what is happening with mere exposure? So, with repeated exposure to an individual, you have the opportunity to develop interpersonal relationship processes that lead to bonds with others. So, with repeated exposure, you have opportunity to interact with that individual, to engage in mutual self-disclosure, to tell that individual personal information about yourself, and they can reciprocate by disclosing personal information about themselves. This helps to build trust, which can lead to interpersonal bonds with others. Learning information about that individual can help to reduce uncertainty and increase the predictability of your social world. So you know more about this individual, you've had repeated interactions with them, and with all this information that you learn about them, you can predict how they're likely to respond to particular events or scenarios. And this increased predictability can lead to familiarity. Right? We tend to like things that are familiar to us. Right? We can understand, right, things that are familiar and predictable to us, and this may lead to the development of interpersonal liking and interpersonal relationships. Now, there was another very interesting effect in the Festinger MIT dorm study. So they also were able to predict who in the building was the most popular. So who had the most friends out of anyone in the apartment. And again, it depended upon the physical layout of the apartment building. What they found was that those individuals who were randomly assigned to apartment units in high traffic areas had more friends than those who were assigned to units in low traffic areas. And so if we look here, the most popular people tended to be individuals who were assigned to Unit 1 or Unit 5, because you can see that they're at the bottom of the stairwell. So not only are they interacting very likely with their next door neighbors, so those in Unit 4 or Unit 2, but they're also likely to interact with those from units who are walking down the stairs, which end directly near their apartment unit. So they're likely to have repeated exposure to individuals in Unit 6, 7, maybe even 8 for our Unit 1, and Units 9 and 10 here for our Unit 5. So this is functional distance. Again, these people on the next floor are a little further away in terms of physical distance, but the idea is that here the effect is driven by who are you likely to interact with. Based on functional distance, we would see that the individuals in Unit 1 are repeatedly crossing paths with 6 and 7 because of the function of the environment in that they're coming down the stairs and passing right by their unit. So this would suggest that if you want to be popular, you should position yourself in high traffic areas if you're taking advantage of functional distance and mere exposure. If you're in high traffic areas, you're going to be interacting and being repeatedly exposed to a higher number of individuals. And I've actually experienced this in my professional life. So when I first came to UNT Dallas, I was hired very late, right before the semester started. And for about the first month that I was at UNT Dallas, I didn't have an office. So they didn't have a place to put me. And so I was temporarily kind of stationed in the faculty lounge. If you've been to campus, it's there on the third floor. And this is where everyone's mailbox is. It's where a kind of, I don't know, eating space is. There's a refrigerator, a microwave, a coffee maker in there. And so a lot of people go into that lounge area to get their mail, to grab a cup of coffee, etc. And so I was just kind of hanging out in there. There was a desk in there and I kind of took that over. And so everyone was passing through and I met a ton of people. And so I formed a lot of relationships in that first month. Then after that, I was assigned an office over in Dow 1 where no one goes. And so I met more people and made more friends that first month than I did the entire rest of the year. And it wasn't that I was more likable in that first month or more friendly, etc. It was just due to functional distance. I just happened to be in that lounge area and was repeatedly exposed to more individuals who went into the lounge to get coffee, etc. And so I met more people and made more friends compared to the rest of the year when I was kind of stuck in a low traffic area in a building where people don't typically hang out.